about cosmopolitics, at least in the way it was formulated by Stengers. There was a critique by Stephen Shaviro. He explains that cosmopolitics is useful in a post-colonial moment when sometimes we pit against, technocratic planners against indigenous people when planning hydroelectric power plants, and that we have to, take both the claims of the experts and the indigenous people, not tolerating the indigenous people, but both at the same level. So this is part of the usefulness of cosmopolitics. But then he asks, what do we do when the others, we are arguing with our Bible-built evangelical fundamentalists? Are we also to take them on the same level? So this is Shaviro's critique of cosmopolitics, or not critique, but the question that he sees is left open. There has been, in the past 20 years, more scholarly production on what's the so-called new cosmopolitanism. Do you know any, or do you, have you thought about this problem with cosmopolitics as proposed by Stengers and Latour?
Sure. I mean,
and perhaps Whitehead might be a good way to solve it.
Yeah. Should I use this?
I mean, the democratization of knowledge is a very messy process. Whitehead says that science is not a fairy tale. And of course, there are different sciences. And there, I would say, is an indigenous form of science, just as there is a European form of science or a Western form of science. And in a cosmopolitical context, specifically with a kind of Whiteheadian valence, knowledge and knowledge production is always a relational and open-ended endeavor, which is to say that there is no final knowledge, there is no final answer, there is no final description or complete description of any, or explanation of any natural or human process. So there's no simple answer here. We have to be specific about each local issue and the extent to which the local people, whether indigenous or not, and scientific experts, what purchase they might have on the issue. There's no universal answer, and I think part of what I do appreciate about cosmopolitics is the shift away from the old form of cosmopolitanism, coming out of Kant, say, which was all about the universality of knowledge and reason and rationality that can be applied in the same way everywhere on the planet, no matter who it is or where it is. Cosmopolitics, as Stengers talks about it, is more sensitive to these local contexts, is more sensitive to the plurality of knowledge-making practices. So there's no easy answer. We have to be specific. Stengers will talk about slow science, which is to say we have to meet the actors and the agencies that are involved in each situation and see what the interplay is. So hopefully that's helpful.
There's a question.
Hi. Thank you. One question is, could you all speculate on the future of foraging society, hunter-gathering society? And is there a place for quote-unquote hybrid economies in foraging societies? Whether it be in the Delta, with folks who fish for a living, or whether in the Kalahari. And then a question about language production, also similar in communities where indigenous people have been displaced. Maybe that connection to the land is different. How do you see the creation of new language as a revolutionary liberatory process for those folks?
Yeah, so I'll jump in on that really quickly. And just talk to one tension I've observed between duck club members and a new demographic of duck hunters that is emerging. Duck club membership is declining in the Delta and elsewhere in the state, and as duck club membership declines, there's a rise of a new duck hunting demographic that is very, very different than that duck club demographic. And this new demographic is Southeast Asian and Latino for the most part. And I have been told that there is a stronger interest in subsistence hunting. It's less about the trophy waterfowl and more about that which is good to eat. Yet, as this transition is taking place, there are tensions between the duck club hunters who have a certain way of hunting for ducks and these new hunters that have a different way. And this feeling like the new hunters don't really understand how to identify the different ducks and go out there and kind of shoot indiscriminately, have a different ethic. And I just bring that up to illustrate kind of a tension that I think exists in duck hunting, but also in fishing as well, and a way to kind of complicate these notions of subsistence foraging, subsistence hunting as potentially embodying some deep local ecological knowledge, because it appears as if the new subsistence hunters actually may not yet have a deep ecological knowledge of certain places.
Just to add to that, I think that the conversation on a surface level is about subsistence hunting and foraging in terms of us as often Western audiences wanting to get back in touch with our species' older forms of sustaining ourselves. But the danger, as has been pointed out here, is that we're moving into that in a very hipster fashion, which is taking place in a lot of different places in the US and in other parts of Europe, where we're entering into it without some form of ecological tradition and without a stronger sort of emotional, biophysical and spiritual sense of what we're doing, which means we're just replicating the same sort of problems. I think that's why, in trying to highlight, say, for example, what I did and maybe what Bettina did through highlighting the importance of the language is these things have to be rooted in mind, body, and soul, not just through the same sort of mental, philosophical approach that we, approach modernity with.
I think I'm a little bit confused about the question just because of the panel question situation, but it's just unnatural. But the notion of the conflict between hunter-forager and hybridity, it makes me wonder if you're asking a question about authenticity, and because I know you're not asking that question, but I'm going to jump on it anyway. But I think everything is hybrid, everything is in a process of coming into being. And I think that the bigger question in terms of hunter-gatherer communities or indigenous sovereignty of the people, the folks that you work with and my people back home and all over the place, is the ways in which the work that we do comes under brutal attack by the armed state, And I think that's whether or not these traditions are allowed to come into being and to continue to exist, and indigenous kinship can continue to be expansive, depends on whether or not we allow the state to continue to incarcerate or kill people, And I think that's really the root of the question for me is I'm not super interested in, I am because I'm a nerd, I'm interested in nuanced analysis, but I'm also interested in action, and that's the thing that I'm most concerned about. And the way that relates critically to language, in my opinion, is that, so Abanye, the Guarani language specifically is, it's meant to be activated in the world, you know? And through a process of colonization, it's been robbed of that. In some ways, it's been robbed of that capacity, right? And it becomes a way of speaking about things, like saying, I'm thirsty, I'm going to have some tea, you know? And it's like a descriptive process of actions. It's the way that mestizo people speak Guarani, you know? And it's not about, it doesn't have the poetry and the action. It doesn't take into account the poetry and the action of the language and the way that we speak to each other. And I think that undoing that is a revolutionary act that takes a lot of work, right? And that's the power of language revitalization projects that aren't just about holding on to a language because, I don't know, it's dying away, but because it has, it's a form of action, right? That's the thing that I'm most interested in.
Okay, well, one more question. I don't think we have time for more.
Thank you. This was actually a very rich panel. Thank you very much, everybody. Because I had a wonderful blend of the philosophical, but also the personal and the experiential. I was very moved by Alejo's grief, personal grief, with the Delta. That was really felt, something like you. And maybe that's one way of perhaps an example for us to go beyond this surface, kind of like hipsters, you very well put it, you know, because we have also hipster yoga, and hipster this and hipster the other, you know, and so this is kind of like the commercialization of everything. But I was thinking that perhaps one way is precisely how do we internalize or re-internalize or rediscover that organic aspect that is unfolding all the time, vis-a-vis the monumental forces against which we are confronted. Because this is when you were saying, for example, that the Delta is going to be affected, and we don't have all the money, perhaps, that the Dutch have had or the experience to protect the Netherlands. How is it going to happen? Or the Kalahari is going away. I'm personally more inclined these days to the philosophical discussion, but I also agonize about the question of the real. You know, how do you, yes, Marx was a bad boy in some ways, but also was a very important bad boy, you know, because he really kind of like decoded capitalism. That's partly why we love to persecute him, because he decoded. But that doesn't mean that we have to be stuck only on what he said 150 years ago. You know, so how do we play with all that? And then with the language, also your reflections on Guarani and your disclaimers that you're not Guarani, but kind of Guarani, and sort of thing, that's honest. But it's also, how can we bring up ideas? And finally, the question, I don't know if you're familiar, Mathew, with the question of cosmotechnics, the discussion that UCUI has been doing in terms of cosmotechnics, the question concerning technology in China, for example, where he's discussing basically the idea that there are different worlds, therefore different cosmogonies, and there are also different techniques. Because I think the question of techniques has been overall given the primacy to the Western mode. So I feel that that's also an area to explore the question of the cosmotechnics different in the question of the hybrid. So I don't know, I mean, it's not really a question, or maybe it's 100 million questions too, you know, for you to reflect for all of us. So thank you very much.
We want to take that, so...
Yeah, hopefully, yes.
Just on the question of grief and becoming sensitive to something so large as an ecological crisis or climate change, I think we need new practices and rituals, new techniques perhaps, to sensitize us. Or maybe we don't need new ones, we need to recover or learn old ones from indigenous peoples who are aware of non-human agencies and what it means for ancestry in a deep sense of other species to be going extinct and what's lost. As problematic as David Attenborough's view of the ecological crisis is, there's this new Our Planet series on Netflix, and there's a scene of walruses in northeastern Russia who have no more ice to lay out on, and they found this, millions of them found this beach, and there's not enough room for all of them, so some of them are crawling up these cliff faces, and they can get up, but when they try to get back down, it was basically, they were filming a mass suicide, and they were just showing in slow motion these walruses falling down the cliff faces, and it's heartbreaking, and it puts an emotional, moral vector, a moral valence to the ecological crisis in a way that I haven't seen done in such a powerful way, and I think we need more of that, and more ritual practices that sensitize us to the non-human world.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I think that the question on a philosophical level, the question of ontology is really important here. I think it comes up in all indigenous cultures, and it's kind of, for some odd reason, we in the West have almost wiped it out of our language, almost perhaps in a way to desensitize ourselves, in a way because we knew we couldn't do what we had to do without desensitizing ourselves. So for me, what I realized is that these things do need to be somatic and they need to be practiced, but because we've trained ourselves into such a philosophical spiral, in a sense, we need to rewind out of a philosophical spiral on some level as well too, for us to allow it to be somatic at a later point. So I think it's a process of these multiple things, sort of working together.
I do think this, as Mathew was saying, grief as an opportunity for renewing or creating new practices and language. I also, I guess going back to Jason's plenary, if we want to think with the capitalist scene and think with the capitalist scene and converging crises that it is creating, these crises aren't just being created right now. These catastrophes have been visited on other species for a very, very long time and other people for a very, very long time. So this grief that I think many of us, and it has been popularized as a relatively new thing, is not new. So all is that to say that we can certainly learn from these already existing grieving practices, these already existing cultures that have had apocalypse visited on them and survived.
Well, thank you, everybody, and